Alexander's empire collapsed the moment he died. What followed was not peace, but decades of war, and from that chaos rose one of the largest and least understood empires of the ancient world. Stretching from the Mediterranean to Central Asia, it ruled through cities, culture, and constant compromise. Today, we're going to uncover who the Seleucids were and how they held Asia together before quietly fading into history. Before we begin, please like the video and subscribe for more in-depth history, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. After Alexander, an empire without a master, after Alexander, an empire without a master, is not a dramatic title invented by later historians. It is the most accurate description of the world that followed his death. When Alexander the Great died in Babylon in 323 BCE, the ancient world did not merely lose a conqueror. It lost the only figure capable of holding together an empire that had expanded faster than any political structure could reasonably support. Alexander was 32 years old. His empire stretched from the Aegean to the Indus, and it had no owner. There was no moment of closure, no clear proclamation, no succession ceremony. Alexander did not leave behind a son old enough to rule, nor a brother capable of command. The question of inheritance had been postponed again and again during his campaigns, pushed aside in favour of conquest. Victory had come too quickly for governance to catch up. In Babylon, the heart of his eastern administration, the generals gathered. They were men who had marched with Alexander since Macedonia, who had crossed deserts and mountains, who had fought together against Persia, Egypt, and India. They were bound by shared experience, but not by trust. Each understood what the others would not yet say aloud. The empire could not remain whole without Alexander, but no one was ready to admit it. At first, the language was unity. Alexander's generals spoke of preserving the empire for the royal house. They named Alexander's half-brother Philip Aridaeus as king, despite his inability to rule, and declared that Roxana's unborn child would share the throne if male. Power, in theory, would be exercised on behalf of kings who could not govern. In practice, power fractured immediately. The arrangement known as the Partition of Babylon divided the empire into satrapies, assigning regions to individual commanders. This was presented as administration. It was in reality the first act of dissolution. Each general now ruled territory in Alexander's name, but with his own army, his own treasury, and his own ambitions. No one intended to give those back. The structure Alexander had inherited from the Persians, a system of satrapies governed under a supreme king, depended on the existence of that king. Without him, the satraps became warlords. Loyalty shifted from dynasty to commander, from throne to army. The empire did not fall apart at once. It came undone through hesitation. For a brief moment, there was still the illusion of continuity. Alexander's body was prepared for burial, his memory invoked to justify decisions, his name used to legitimize authority. But beneath the surface, reality moved faster than ceremony. Armies did not wait for consensus. Generals did not trust one another. Each knew that delay meant vulnerability. Within months, alliances hardened. Within years, war became inevitable. The wars that followed, later known as the conflicts of the Diadochi, were not civil wars in the modern sense. They were wars of inheritance without a will, fought by men who all believed themselves entitled to rule. No single successor emerged because no single successor could command universal loyalty. What Alexander had held together by personal authority now required force. Macedonian veterans became kingmakers. Cities were coerced, bribed, or punished. Satraps fortified borders that had never been meant to exist. The idea of a single empire survived longer in rhetoric than in reality. Geography worked against unity. Distance made control impossible. Communication lagged behind ambition. Ruling from Babylon or Pella over lands that stretched thousands of kilometres required a bureaucracy Alexander had only begun to imagine. His campaigns had relied on momentum, not institutions. Once movement stopped, the weaknesses became visible. Egypt drifted first, secure behind natural borders. Asia Minor fragmented. The eastern provinces became increasingly autonomous, and yet no one was willing to formally declare the empire dead. Alexander's legacy was too powerful to abandon. His image, his achievements, his aura of invincibility continued to dominate political thinking. Each general claimed to act in his name. Each positioned himself as protector of the empire rather than its destroyer. This contradiction defined the age. Kingship itself entered a period of redefinition. Under Alexander, kingship had been personal, charismatic, and absolute. After him, it became territorial. Power was no longer tied to the idea of ruling the world, but to controlling specific regions and defending them against rivals. The dream of universal empire faded slowly. Among the commanders navigating this chaos was Seleucus I Nicator. At the time of Alexander's death, Seleucus was not the most powerful of the generals. He did not immediately claim kingship. He survived by patience, adaptability, and an understanding of how quickly circumstances could change. This was the environment that shaped the Seleucid world. Seleucus watched as stronger figures overreached and fell. He learned that authority in the post-Alexander world did not come from declarations, but from survival. Control of land mattered more than claims to legitimacy. Armies followed those who could pay and protect them. The empire was no longer something to inherit, it was something to rebuild, piece by piece. As wars spread across former Persian lands, the populations beneath them experienced something different from the ambitions of generals. For cities and villages, Alexander's death did not feel like liberation or collapse. It felt like uncertainty. Taxation continued. Garrisons remained. Greek administrators stayed in place. But allegiance became unstable. Local elites adapted quickly. They learned to negotiate with new masters, to shift loyalty when necessary, to survive regardless of who claimed the throne. This adaptability would shape the Hellenistic world more than any single battle. What replaced Alexander's empire was not chaos alone, it was a transformation. The unified conquest gave way to competing kingdoms. Greek culture spread not through centralized rule, but through cities founded to secure territory. Armies became instruments of state rather than companions of a single king. Administration became regional rather than imperial. The idea of Alexander's empire survived, but only as memory. By the time the last pretenses of unity were abandoned, the ancient world had already changed. Power no longer flowed from one centre. It radiated outward from several. The age of the successor kingdoms had begun, and from that fracture, new empires would rise, including the Seleucid realm, not as heirs to Alexander's throne, but as products of his absence. The empire without a master did not collapse in a single moment. It dissolved into opportunity. What followed was not the end of Alexander's world, but its reinvention, shaped by men who ruled not because they were chosen, but because they endured. This is where the Seleucid story truly begins. Seleucus Nicator, from general to king. Seleucus Nicator did not begin as a conqueror with a vision of empire. He began as a survivor. In the chaotic years after the death of Alexander the Great, survival was not a passive condition. It was an active skill, requiring restraint, timing, and an instinct for when to advance and when to disappear. Many of Alexander's generals were stronger, richer, or more famous than Seleucus. Most of them did not last. Seleucus did. At the time of Alexander's death in 323 BCE, Seleucus was already an experienced officer. He had commanded elite units, crossed Asia, and watched empires fall. But he was not yet a king, and he did not immediately claim to be one. In the early struggles of the Diadochi, that hesitation would prove decisive. The world Seleucus inherited was unstable by design. Alexander's empire had fractured into satrapies held together by little more than memory and fear. Generals ruled provinces in the name of kings who could not rule. Alliances shifted constantly. Loyalty followed armies, not bloodlines. Ambition was everywhere, but legitimacy was scarce. Seleucus understood this reality early. Rather than declaring himself ruler of vast territories he could not yet hold, he accepted subordinate roles, serving under more powerful figures when necessary. This was not weakness, it was calculation. Seleucus learned how power functioned in the post-Alexandrian world, how armies were funded, how cities were controlled, how legitimacy could be borrowed before it was claimed. His first major opportunity came in Babylon. Appointed satrap of Babylonia, Seleucus gained control of one of the most strategically important regions in the former empire. Babylon was not merely a city, it was an administrative hub, a treasury, and a gateway between East and West. Whoever controlled it controlled movement, communication, and resources. But holding Babylon was dangerous. The great mistake of many Diadochi was assuming that authority granted by agreement would be respected in practice. Seleucus learned otherwise when stronger rivals threatened his position. Forced into exile, he fled west, abandoning Babylon temporarily rather than dying for it. This retreat defined him. Seleucus chose survival over pride. He waited while other generals destroyed one another through open warfare. He built alliances quietly. He preserved his reputation as competent and reliable. When the moment came, he returned, not as a subordinate, but as a claimant. With a small but loyal force, Seleucus retook Babylon in 312 BCE. This moment would later be remembered as the symbolic beginning of the Seleucid dynasty. It was not marked by ceremony or proclamation. It was marked by control. Seleucus held the city, secured its resources, and defended it successfully. From that point forward, momentum shifted. Seleucus expanded eastward with remarkable speed. Former Persian territories fell under his authority not through massive battles, but through negotiation, pressure, and the quiet replacement of administrators. Cities accepted his rule because he offered stability. Armies followed him because he paid them. Kingship, in this era, was practical. Seleucus did not yet style himself King of Asia. He ruled first, then claimed. This order mattered. Where other successors declared grand titles early and struggled to defend them, Seleucus allowed legitimacy to grow out of success. The eastern campaigns were as important ideologically as they were territorially. By securing Mesopotamia, Iran, and beyond, Seleucus positioned himself as heir not only to Alexander, but to the ancient traditions of Near Eastern kingship. He ruled lands accustomed to empire, administration, and long-distance authority. To govern them, he adopted flexibility. Greek cities were founded as anchors of control, populated by settlers loyal to Seleucus. Local elites were retained where useful. Persian administrative practices were adapted rather than discarded. This blend of Macedonian military rule and Eastern governance would define Seleucid power. Seleucus did not impose uniformity. He imposed structure. The turning point in his rise came at the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BCE. This was not merely a clash of armies, but a reckoning among the successors. Rival kings faced one another openly. When the battle ended, one of the greatest contenders lay dead, and the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. Seleucus emerged as the dominant ruler of the East. In the aftermath, he claimed the royal title openly. No longer a general, no longer a satrap, Seleucus became king, Nicator, the victor. His authority now rested on territory, army, and recognition by peers. The Seleucid Empire was born not in a single act but through accumulation. Seleucus established new capitals, most notably Seleucia on the Tigris, a city designed to rival Babylon itself. These foundations were political statements. They signalled a new order, Greek in language, imperial in ambition, and Eastern in scale. Kingship under Seleucus was expansive but fragile. The empire stretched from the Mediterranean to Central Asia, a distance that challenged communication and control. Seleucus understood this danger. Rather than rule everything directly, he delegated authority, trusted capable subordinates, and relied on cities as centres of power. Yet ambition never disappeared. Seleucus envisioned an empire that could reunite Alexander's conquests under a single dynasty. He campaigned west, challenging rivals in Asia Minor and beyond. His success brought prestige, but also new enemies. In old age, victory caught up with him. After securing recognition across much of the former empire, Seleucus moved to claim Macedonia itself, the symbolic heart of Alexander's legacy. It was a final act of ambition, and it proved fatal. Seleucus was assassinated shortly after crossing into Europe, killed not by a rival king, but by a displaced prince seeking survival. His death was abrupt, his legacy was not. Seleucus left behind more than territory. He left a model of rule suited to a fractured world. His dynasty would endure for generations, adapting to pressure from Rome, Parthia, and internal rebellion. Though the Seleucid Empire would eventually decline, it would shape the political and cultural landscape of the Near East for centuries. Seleucus Nicator was not the strongest of Alexander's successors. He was the most patient. He did not seize an empire in a moment of chaos. He assembled one from endurance, timing, and restraint. In an age where ambition destroyed many, Seleucus survived long enough to rule, and from that survival, a dynasty was born. An empire stretched thin. An empire stretched thin is not a metaphor when speaking of the Seleucid world. It is a literal description of geography, distance, and strain. The Seleucid Empire was not simply large, it was vast in a way that challenged the limits of ancient administration, communication, and power itself. To rule, it was not merely to govern territory, but to fight geography every single day. At its height, the Seleucid realm extended from the eastern Mediterranean coast across Anatolia, Mesopotamia, Iran, and deep into Central Asia. It touched the Aegean in the west and approached the Indus basin in the east. This was not a compact empire with natural borders. It was a chain of regions held together by roads, garrisons, cities, and the constant presence, or threat, of royal authority. Distance was the first enemy. From the western capitals near the Mediterranean to the eastern satrapies of Bactria, months of travel separated decision from consequence. Orders sent from Antioch could arrive long after circumstances had changed. Rebellions could begin, spread, and solidify before the king even learned of them. Geography ensured that authority was always slightly late. This delay shaped everything. The Seleucid kings inherited much from earlier Persian systems, particularly the idea that vast spaces could be ruled through delegated authority. Satraps governed provinces, collected taxes, raised troops, and maintained order. But unlike the Achaemenid kings, the Seleucids lacked centuries of institutional continuity. Their authority was newer, more fragile, and often contested. Every satrap was a potential rival. In theory, the king stood above all governors as the sole source of legitimacy. In practice, a distant governor with local support and a loyal army could behave like a king in all but name. Geography gave them the time and space to do so. The empire's terrain magnified this problem. Mountains divided regions. Deserts slowed movement. Rivers both connected and isolated. Asia Minor alone contained enough natural barriers to fragment authority. The Iranian plateau posed its own challenges, with long distances between settlements and harsh climates that strained supply lines. Holding territory required constant presence. To compensate, the Seleucids relied heavily on cities. Urban foundations were not merely cultural projects, they were instruments of control. Greek and Macedonian settlers were planted in strategic locations, forming communities loyal to the dynasty. These cities served as administrative centres, military hubs, and symbols of royal power. Yet even cities could not solve distance entirely. Between urban centres lay countryside governed by local traditions, elites, and loyalties. Communication flowed unevenly. Royal authority was strongest where the king or his armies had been seen recently, and weakest where memory replaced presence. Asia itself was not a single political space. The western regions of the empire were deeply entangled with the Hellenistic world. Greek language, institutions, and culture dominated administration. In the east, older Persian traditions remained influential. Local elites expected continuity rather than replacement. The Seleucids ruled over peoples who had lived under empires for centuries and who knew how to endure change. This diversity was both strength and weakness. It allowed flexibility, but it prevented uniform rule. Laws, customs, and expectations differed from region to region. What worked in Syria failed in Iran. What stabilized Mesopotamia alienated Asia Minor. The king ruled many worlds at once. The problem was not only distance, but simultaneity. Crises rarely occurred one at a time. A rebellion in the west could coincide with unrest in the east. External threats emerged along multiple frontiers. The king could march to only one place. Everywhere else had to wait, and waiting created opportunity. This structural strain explains why the Seleucid Empire never enjoyed prolonged peace. Even during strong reigns, energy was spent suppressing revolts, reaffirming loyalty, and moving armies across enormous spaces. Governance was reactive as much as strategic. The empire demanded movement. Royal progressions were essential. Kings travelled constantly, appearing in cities, inspecting garrisons, holding courts, distributing gifts, and reminding subjects that authority was real. Absence was dangerous. Presence was exhausting. No Seleucid king could ever truly rest. Economics added another layer of pressure. Taxation varied across regions, reflecting local productivity and tradition. Transporting revenue over long distances was costly and risky. Coinage helped unify the economy, but minting and distribution required stability that distance undermined. An eastern province might be rich, but its wealth could be difficult to extract. Military logistics were even more demanding. Armies required food, fodder, pay, and equipment. Campaigns across deserts or mountains stretched supply lines thin. Losing control of a single region could disrupt entire military systems. Distance turned setbacks into disasters. The farther the frontier, the harder it was to recover losses. Reinforcements arrived late. Replacement administrators lacked local knowledge. Enemies adapted faster than imperial response. Over time, peripheral regions learned this. Bactria drifted away, not because it was conquered, but because it was distant. Local rulers filled the vacuum left by delayed authority. They minted their own coins, raised their own armies, and eventually ruled openly. Distance had become autonomy. The Seleucid kings understood this danger, but solutions were limited. They could divide the empire, appoint co-rulers, or grant autonomy, but each option weakened central authority. They could concentrate power, but that required constant military presence everywhere. No ancient state could win that contest forever. The empire stretched thin not because of incompetence, but because of scale. Its size exceeded the administrative technology of its age. Roads, messengers, and institutions could not keep pace with ambition. And yet, the Seleucid Empire endured for generations. That endurance itself is remarkable. It survived not by eliminating distance, but by managing it through cities, alliances, local elites, and selective enforcement. It accepted imperfection. It ruled unevenly, adapting to circumstance rather than imposing rigid uniformity. This flexibility delayed collapse, but it also ensured fragmentation. What began as a unified successor state slowly transformed into a patchwork of regions with varying degrees of loyalty. Some remained firmly Seleucid for centuries. Others slipped away quietly, becoming independent kingdoms without dramatic rupture. The empire did not shatter, it thinned. By the time new powers rose in the west and east, the Seleucid realm was already stretched beyond recovery. Geography had done what enemies alone could not. Distance eroded authority, space diluted power, scale defeated permanence. The Seleucid Empire was not undone by a single failure. It was undone by the simple fact that Asia was too large to rule from one throne for long, and in that struggle, between ambition and geography, the limits of ancient empire were finally exposed. Kings of two worlds, Greek rule over eastern lands. The Seleucid Empire was never a single cultural world. From its first days, it existed in tension between Greek rulers and eastern lands, between imported traditions and deeply rooted local identities. To rule this empire was not simply to govern territory, but to balance two civilizations that understood power, society, and legitimacy in very different ways. This was an empire of two worlds. The Seleucid kings were Macedonian Greeks by origin. Their authority descended from conquest, from Alexander's campaigns, and from the belief that Greek culture represented civilization itself. Greek language, education, political ideals, and urban life formed the foundation of elite identity across the Hellenistic world. Yet the lands they ruled, Mesopotamia, Iran, Syria, Anatolia, Central Asia, had their own ancient traditions. These regions had been governed by empires long before Alexander arrived. They were accustomed to kingship, bureaucracy, religion, and hierarchy. They did not see themselves as newly civilized. They saw themselves as enduring. Greek rule entered these lands as a layer placed on top of something far older. The Seleucid solution to this challenge was not cultural replacement, but selective dominance. Greek elites occupied the highest levels of power. Kings, generals, governors, and administrators were overwhelmingly Greek or Macedonian. Greek language became the language of the court, administration, and coinage. Greek education marked one as part of the ruling class. Cities were the primary instruments of this rule. Seleucid kings founded dozens of new cities across Asia, often named after themselves or their dynastic ancestors. These cities were Greek in layout, law, and culture. They had councils, assemblies, gymnasia, and theatres. They were meant to reproduce the Greek polis far from the Aegean. In these cities, Greek settlers lived according to familiar norms. They governed themselves, trained their sons in Greek education, and maintained cultural distance from surrounding populations. These urban islands formed a network of loyalty stretching across the empire. But beyond the city walls lay a different world. Most of the Seleucid population was not Greek. They were farmers, artisans, priests, and local elites whose identities had been shaped by centuries of Persian, Babylonian, and regional traditions. Their languages, religions, and social structures did not disappear with the arrival of Greek rule. The Seleucids did not attempt to erase these cultures. Instead, they ruled above them. Local elites were often retained in administrative roles below the highest level. Traditional religious institutions continued to function. Temples remained powerful. Laws were adapted rather than replaced. The empire operated through accommodation as much as command. This coexistence created stability, but also tension. Greek elites viewed themselves as rulers by right of conquest. And culture. They often saw local populations as subjects rather than partners. Cultural separation reinforced hierarchy. Access to power flowed through Greek identity. For local elites, cooperation was pragmatic. Aligning with Greek rulers preserved status and property. Resistance was costly and uncertain. Adaptation offered survival. Over time, new hybrid identities emerged. Some local elites adopted Greek language and customs while retaining regional traditions. Greek gods were associated with local deities. Art blended styles. Administrative practices combined Greek forms with Eastern substance. This process is often called Hellenization, but it was not one-directional. Greek culture changed as well. Greek rulers adopted Eastern models of kingship. Court ceremony grew more elaborate. Royal authority became more absolute. The king was no longer just a first citizen among equals, but a distant, almost divine figure. This transformation was not accidental. In the Eastern world, kingship had always been sacred. Authority required display, ritual, and separation. The Seleucid kings learned quickly that ruling Asia required more than Greek political ideals. It required visible power. Thus emerged a hybrid monarchy, Greek in language, Eastern in practice. This duality defined the Seleucid state. It also created friction. Greek settlers often resented the influence of local traditions at court. Local populations sometimes resisted Greek privilege. Rebellions erupted periodically, not always against the king, but against the structures of cultural dominance. Some regions accepted Greek rule more readily than others. Coastal areas and long urbanized regions adapted quickly. Deep inland territories retained stronger local identities. In distant eastern provinces, Greek presence was thinner and local autonomy grew stronger. Distance amplified cultural difference. The Seleucid kings tried to manage this complexity through flexibility. They adjusted policies region by region. They negotiated with temples. They rewarded loyalty with autonomy. Uniformity was impossible. Balance was essential, but balance required constant attention. Whenever the king was strong, tensions remained contained. When authority weakened, divisions widened. Cultural difference became political opportunity. Breakaway kingdoms often emerged where Greek presence was weakest and local identity strongest. This pattern repeated across the empire, yet for centuries the system endured. Greek rule did not collapse immediately because it did not demand total assimilation. It allowed difference while enforcing hierarchy. That compromise sustained the empire longer than conquest alone could have. The Seleucid world was not harmonious, but it was functional. It produced cities, trade, scholarship, and administrative continuity. It linked Mediterranean culture with Asia. It shaped identities that would persist long after the empire itself vanished. Kings of two worlds did not fully belong to either. They spoke Greek, ruled Asian lands, adopted Eastern kingship, and governed through hybrid systems. Their empire was neither fully Greek nor fully Eastern. It was something new. And in that tension between ruler and ruled, city and countryside, culture and tradition, the Seleucid Empire defined the limits and possibilities of ruling a diverse world, not through unity, but through uneasy balance. That balance would shape the fate of the empire and the history that followed. Cities as power, Antioch, Seleucia, and imperial control. Cities were the true architecture of Seleucid power. Armies conquered, kings claimed titles, treaties shifted borders, but cities held the empire together. For the Seleucid kings, urban foundations were not symbols of civilization alone. They were instruments of rule, anchors of authority, and solutions to a problem no army could permanently solve: how to govern vast lands from a distant throne. This was empire by city. When the Seleucid dynasty emerged from the chaos after Alexander the Great, it inherited territory that was immense, diverse, and resistant to uniform control. Mountains, deserts, and long distances made direct rule impossible. The Seleucid response was deliberate and systematic. They built power where power could endure, inside cities. Among these, two stood above all others: Antioch and Seleucia on the Tigris. These were not accidental foundations. They were strategic decisions. Antioch, founded by Seleucus I Nicator, became the western heart of the empire. Situated near the Mediterranean, it controlled access between Asia and the Greek world. Seleucia on the Tigris, built near Babylon, became the eastern administrative core, close to ancient centres of power, trade routes and population. Together, they formed a dual axis of rule. Cities like Antioch and Seleucia were designed to do what armies could not: stabilize territory through permanence. Walls, streets, temples, markets, and councils created continuity. Where a garrison might leave, a city endured. Urban foundations served multiple functions at once. Administratively, cities housed governors, courts, treasuries, and record-keeping institutions. Taxes flowed into cities before moving outward to support armies and royal projects. Law was administered from urban centres, giving the king's authority a visible daily presence. Militarily, cities were fortresses and supply hubs. Garrisons stationed within them secured regions without requiring constant campaigning. Roads radiated outward, allowing troops to move quickly when unrest arose. Economically, cities concentrated wealth. Markets drew rural produce inward. Coinage was minted locally. Trade routes intersected in urban spaces, binding distant regions into a single economic system. Culturally, cities were unmistakably Greek. They followed grid plans, featured agoras and gymnasia, and governed themselves through councils modelled on the polis. Greek language dominated public life. Education, athletic competition, and civic ritual reinforced elite identity. This was not accidental cultural expression. It was political design. By populating cities with Greek and Macedonian settlers, often veterans rewarded with land, the Seleucid kings created loyal communities embedded within foreign landscapes. These settlers depended on the king for status, protection, and privilege. In return, they formed a dependable base of support. The countryside, by contrast, remained largely local. Farmers, villages, temples, and regional elites continued older traditions. They paid taxes, supplied labour, and accepted authority, but they did not become Greek cities. The Seleucid system accepted this divide. Cities ruled, countryside sustained. This separation was a feature, not a flaw. The Seleucid kings understood that forcing cultural uniformity would provoke resistance. Cities allowed them to rule indirectly, projecting power outward while leaving daily life largely untouched. Yet cities were not autonomous republics. Despite Greek-style institutions, real authority flowed upward to the king. Civic councils existed, but royal officials oversaw them. Laws could be overridden. Governors intervened when order was threatened. Freedom existed within boundaries set by empire. Antioch exemplified this balance perfectly. As a capital, it was vibrant, wealthy, and cosmopolitan. Merchants, administrators, soldiers, scholars, and artisans mixed in its streets. It hosted royal ceremonies and housed imperial archives. From Antioch, decrees radiated across Western Asia. But Antioch was also watched carefully. A city with too much wealth and influence could become dangerous. Seleucid kings managed urban elites through patronage, honours, and sometimes force. Civic pride was encouraged, but never allowed to rival royal authority. Seleucia on the Tigris played a similar role in the east. Built to rival Babylon, it absorbed much of the region's administrative function. It connected Greek governance with Mesopotamian infrastructure. Persian traditions of record-keeping and taxation were adapted within a Greek urban framework. This blend made Seleucia indispensable. The city became a hinge between worlds, Greek in form, Eastern in function. Through it, the Seleucid kings governed lands that had known empire long before Alexander. Across the empire, dozens of smaller cities extended this system. Each acted as a node in a wider network. Together, they created a lattice of control that compensated for distance. Where kings could not be everywhere, cities could. But this system carried risks. Cities were expensive. They required settlers, resources, and protection. Their loyalty depended on continued privilege. When royal authority weakened, cities could defect, resist, or align with rivals. Urban power was stable, but conditional. As pressures mounted from war, rebellion, and foreign invasion, the Seleucid kings relied even more heavily on cities. This increased their importance but also their leverage. A city that closed its gates or switched allegiance could disrupt entire regions. Over time, the empire's fate became inseparable from its urban network. When cities flourished, the empire functioned. When cities faltered, control unravelled. The Seleucid reliance on cities reveals a deeper truth about ancient empire. Power did not reside solely in kings or armies. It resided in institutions that could outlast individuals. Cities were such institutions. They were where authority became routine, where law became habit, where empire became normal. Antioch and Seleucia were not just capitals. They were mechanisms designed to translate conquest into governance. Through cities, the Seleucid kings ruled lands too vast to conquer again and again. Through cities, they projected authority across Asia. Through cities, they held together an empire stretched thin. This was power made permanent, not through force alone, but through stone, street, and settlement. And when the Seleucid Empire eventually declined, it was not because cities failed, but because too many of them no longer needed the king. The cities endured. The empire did not. That, more than any battle, defines how Seleucid power truly worked. Gods, kings, and cult. Religion in the Seleucid world. Religion in the Seleucid world was never a private matter of belief. It was a language of power, legitimacy, and survival. To rule a vast and culturally diverse empire stretching from the Mediterranean to Central Asia, the Seleucid kings could not rely on armies and cities alone. They needed something deeper, something that spoke to identity, tradition, and cosmic order. They needed religion. But this was not a world with a single faith or a unified theology. The Seleucid Empire ruled over Greeks, Macedonians, Babylonians, Persians, Syrians, Anatolians, and countless local communities, each with their own gods, rituals, and sacred spaces. The challenge was not conversion, it was coexistence. This was an empire held together by cult. The Seleucid kings inherited a religious landscape already shaped by centuries of imperial rule. Under the Achaemenid Persians, local religions had been tolerated and supported so long as they did not threaten royal authority. Alexander had largely continued this policy, presenting himself as a liberator who respected native gods while introducing Greek religious forms. The Seleucids followed this tradition, but with greater urgency. Unlike Alexander, they lacked personal charisma that could transcend culture. Unlike the Persians, they ruled as foreign elites in many regions. Religion became their most flexible tool for legitimacy. At the centre of Seleucid religious identity stood the Greek gods. Zeus, Apollo, Athena, and other Olympians appeared prominently on coinage, temples, and royal imagery. Zeus in particular symbolized kingship, authority, and cosmic order. By associating themselves with Zeus, Seleucid kings presented their rule as natural and divinely sanctioned. Coins mattered here. Seleucid coinage circulated across the empire, carrying images of gods alongside royal names. Every transaction reinforced the idea that king and deity were linked. This was not subtle propaganda. It was daily ritual. Yet Greek gods alone could not rule Asia. In Mesopotamia, ancient temples still dominated urban life. In Iran, long-standing religious traditions shaped morality and kingship. In Syria and Anatolia, local deities commanded deep loyalty. The Seleucid kings understood that ignoring these beliefs would provoke resistance, so they did something more complex. They integrated. Local temples were funded and protected. Priests retained status. Traditional rituals continued. In many cases, local gods were identified with Greek ones, creating syncretic pairings that allowed continuity under a new imperial framework. A storm god became Zeus. A healing god became Apollo. A mother goddess became Artemis. This process did not erase belief. It reframed it. For local populations, worship could continue with familiar names and rituals. For Greek rulers, the empire appeared unified under recognizable divine order. Everyone participated in the same sacred system without believing exactly the same thing. This flexibility was deliberate. The Seleucid kings did not demand theological agreement. They demanded loyalty. Religion was valuable because it stabilized society, reinforced hierarchy, and justified authority. Nowhere was this clearer than in ruler cult. Over time, Seleucid kings began to receive divine honours, not necessarily as gods themselves, but as beings favoured by the gods. Temples, festivals, and priesthoods dedicated to the royal family emerged across the empire. This was not vanity alone. Ruler cult served a political function. It linked loyalty to the king with religious obligation. Honouring the ruler became part of honouring the divine order. Rebellion, therefore, became more than treason. It became impiety. Yet ruler cult was carefully calibrated. In Greek cities, it followed familiar patterns of hero worship and civic honours. In eastern regions, it echoed older traditions of sacred kingship. The king became a bridge between worlds, Greek in form, Eastern in meaning. Kingship itself became ritualized. Public appearances, sacrifices, festivals, and processions reinforced royal authority. The king was seen performing religious duties, maintaining harmony between gods and people. His success in war and governance was interpreted as divine favour. Failure, by contrast, was dangerous. A king who lost battles or faced constant rebellion risked being seen as abandoned by the gods. Religious legitimacy could evaporate quickly. This made stability essential, not only politically but spiritually. The Seleucid court understood this risk. They invested heavily in temples, priesthoods, and religious festivals. Sacred spaces were restored or expanded. New cult centres were founded in cities to reinforce loyalty. Religion was not an afterthought. It was infrastructure. At the same time, diversity never disappeared. Different regions emphasized different gods. Local traditions remained strong. The empire did not homogenize belief. It coordinated it. This coordination required negotiation with priestly elites who wielded significant influence over communities. Priests were power brokers. Supporting a temple meant securing loyalty. Offending it could destabilize an entire region. Seleucid kings learned to respect sacred boundaries even as they asserted authority. This balance was fragile. When religious policies aligned with local expectations, stability followed. When they did not, unrest erupted. Nowhere was this clearer than in moments when royal authority weakened and religious identity became a rallying point for resistance. Religion could unify, but it could also divide. As the Seleucid Empire faced increasing pressure from rivals and internal fragmentation, religious legitimacy became harder to maintain. Breakaway regions developed their own sacred narratives. New powers claimed divine support. The king's role as cosmic mediator weakened. Yet the religious system the Seleucids built did not vanish with their decline. Their model of religious pluralism under imperial rule influenced later empires profoundly. Roman governance in the East adopted similar strategies. Even subsequent Near Eastern states inherited the idea that legitimacy required religious accommodation rather than suppression. The Seleucid world was not secular, but it was pragmatic. Gods, kings, and cult formed a triangle of power, each reinforcing the other. The king ruled because the gods favoured him. The gods were honoured because the king protected their worship. The people obeyed because order appeared divinely sanctioned. This was not belief imposed by force. It was belief shaped by necessity. In an empire of immense diversity, religion became the language that everyone understood, even when they spoke different theological dialects. The Seleucid kings did not invent this system, but they refined it, and through it they ruled lands too vast, too ancient, and too varied to be held by power alone. Religion was not the soul of the Seleucid Empire. It was its glue, and when that glue weakened, the empire followed. War without end, the diadochi and endless conflict. The wars that followed Alexander's death were not a single conflict with a clear beginning and end. They were a condition of the age. For nearly half a century, the lands Alexander had conquered were locked in a cycle of violence so persistent that peace itself became temporary. Treaties were pauses, alliances were provisional. War was the default state. This was war without end. The men who fought these wars, the diadochi, the successors, were not rebels or invaders. They were Alexander's own generals, companions who had marched with him from Macedonia to the edge of India. They knew one another's strengths, habits, and ambitions. They shared a past, but no future. Alexander had left behind no mechanism for succession. In that absence, legitimacy became contested terrain. Each general claimed to act in the name of the royal house, while quietly working to secure personal power. At first, none openly declared kingship. That restraint did not last. The first wars were framed as guardianship. Armies fought ostensibly to protect the empire for Alexander's heirs. In reality, they fought to control territory, treasuries, and strategic cities. The empire fractured not because unity was impossible, but because cooperation offered no advantage. Trust collapsed quickly. Every settlement created winners and losers. Every agreement shifted the balance of power. Generals who emerged stronger were immediately seen as threats by the rest. War fed on success. Borders moved constantly. Regions changed hands multiple times within a single generation. Cities were besieged, taken, lost, and retaken. Garrisons switched allegiance. Soldiers followed commanders who could pay them. Loyalty was transactional. The geography of the former empire magnified the conflict. Its vast size meant wars could be fought simultaneously on multiple fronts. While one army marched in Asia Minor, another clashed in Mesopotamia, while a third campaigned in Greece or Egypt. No single victory could end the conflict. There was always another front. The armies themselves became instruments of instability. Veteran troops were highly trained, disciplined, and dangerous, but they were also politically aware. They knew their value. They expected rewards. Commanders who failed to deliver land or payment risked mutiny. War became a means of survival for soldiers as much as kings. This perpetual conflict reshaped warfare itself. Battles grew larger and more decisive, but also more destructive. Siege warfare intensified as cities became prizes worth years of campaigning. Civilians suffered as fields were ravaged, populations displaced, and economies disrupted. The countryside paid the price for imperial ambition. Cities, too, were transformed by war. Fortifications expanded. Civic life adapted to military reality. Urban elites learned to negotiate with whoever held power at the moment. Political flexibility became a survival skill. No region escaped untouched. The Eastern territories, which would later form the Seleucid heartland, were especially affected. Campaigns swept repeatedly through Mesopotamia and Iran. Control was asserted, challenged, and reasserted. Administration struggled to keep pace with violence. The Battle of Ipsus marked a turning point, but not an end. One of the most powerful contenders fell, and territory was redistributed yet again. For a moment, it appeared that a new balance might emerge, but victory only created new tensions. Survivors adjusted strategies, formed new alliances, and prepared for further conflict. Kingship finally became explicit. One by one, the successors declared themselves kings, abandoning the pretense of unity. This did not end the wars, it formalized them. Conflicts now took on dynastic character, but the underlying instability remained. The Hellenistic world settled into armed rivalry. For the Seleucid realm, this meant governing while fighting. Resources that might have strengthened administration or integration were diverted to armies. Kings spent years on campaign, away from capitals and institutions. Governance became episodic. Victory brought territory, territory brought new enemies, and the cycle continued. Exhaustion set in gradually. Generations grew up knowing only war. Soldiers aged in camps rather than cities. Treasuries emptied and refilled through plunder rather than taxation. Stability became localized and temporary. The strain showed everywhere. Peripheral regions drifted away as central authority weakened. Local rulers asserted independence when imperial attention shifted elsewhere. Distance, already a challenge, became an invitation to autonomy. War, intended to preserve power, undermined it. Yet it would be a mistake to see the Diadochi Wars as pointless chaos. They shaped the political map of the ancient world. From their violence emerged new kingdoms, new borders, and new identities. The Seleucid Empire itself was forged in this furnace. Its rulers learned that survival required adaptability. That authority could not be assumed. That power had to be renewed constantly through presence, reward, and force. These lessons shaped Seleucid governance for centuries. But the cost was immense. The endless conflict drained populations, eroded legitimacy, and normalized violence as governance. Peace, when it came, felt unnatural. By the time the wars subsided into uneasy balance, the world Alexander had conquered was gone. In its place stood rival empires, defined not by shared vision, but by mutual exhaustion. The Diadochi did not destroy Alexander's legacy. They transformed it. They proved that conquest without succession creates instability without limit. That empire built on a single will cannot survive that will's absence. And that war, once unleashed as a political tool, rarely knows how to stop. War without end was not a failure of individuals alone. It was the consequence of an empire built faster than it could be inherited. And for the Seleucid world, it set the tone for everything that followed. Rule under pressure, authority contested, and power always temporary. Peace would come, but it would never again be taken for granted. The eastern frontier, Bactria, Parthia, and separation. The eastern frontier of the Seleucid Empire was never a fixed line on a map. It was a zone of distance, ambition, and gradual separation. A place where imperial authority weakened not because it was defeated outright, but because it arrived too late, too rarely, and with too little force to remain unquestioned. What the Seleucid kings lost in the east was not taken in a single war. It drifted away. This was the quiet unmaking of empire. At its height, the Seleucid realm extended far beyond the traditional centres of Greek power. It reached into lands that had once been ruled by the Achaemenid Persians, and before them by empires even older. These eastern territories, Media, Parthia, Bactria, Sogdiana, were not marginal provinces. They were wealthy, strategic, and deeply embedded in transcontinental trade networks that connected the Mediterranean to Central Asia and India, but they were also distant from the western capitals of Antioch and Seleucia on the Tigris. The eastern frontier lay months away by road. Mountains, deserts, and hostile terrain stood between the king and his father's governors. Communication was slow, reinforcement slower. Authority, when it arrived, was already outdated. This distance shaped everything. The Seleucid kings attempted to rule the east through satraps, provincial governors who wielded military, administrative, and fiscal power. In theory, these men represented the king. In practice, they often were the king in their regions. They commanded local armies, negotiated with neighbours, collected taxes, and dispensed justice. Over time, the difference between governor and ruler blurred. Bactria illustrates this process clearly. Located beyond the Iranian plateau, Bactria was fertile, wealthy, and strategically positioned along trade routes leading toward India and the Silk Road corridors of Central Asia. Greek settlers had been established there since Alexander's campaigns, forming cities that blended Hellenistic urban life with local traditions. One of these cities, Iconium, stood as a symbol of Seleucid ambition in the east. Greek architecture, inscriptions, and institutions existed alongside Eastern realities. The city was unmistakably Hellenistic, but it was also far from the centres of Seleucid power. As long as the central government was strong, Bactria remained loyal, but loyalty depended on presence. When internal wars distracted the Seleucid kings, Eastern satraps gained autonomy by default. They raised troops locally, they minted coins, they defended borders without consulting the king. None of this was rebellion at first, it was necessity. Then necessity became independence. In the mid-3rd century BCE, the satrap of Bactria declared himself king. This act did not follow a dramatic uprising or decisive battle. It followed decades of distance, neglect, and self-reliance. The Greco-Bactrian kingdom emerged as a separate state, not because it overthrew Seleucid rule, but because Seleucid rule had faded. Bactria was not lost in defeat, it was lost in silence. Parthia followed a different but related path. Unlike Bactria, Parthia was less urbanized and more exposed to nomadic influences from the Eurasian steppe. It was a frontier region in every sense, militarily volatile, culturally mixed, and difficult to control. Seleucid authority in Parthia depended heavily on local arrangements and military presence. When that presence weakened, new powers emerged. Among them were the Parni, a nomadic group who would later become known as the Parthians. At first, they were a regional threat. Then they became a political alternative. The Parthians exploited the same structural weakness that allowed Bactria to separate: distance. Seleucid armies were occupied elsewhere, fighting rivals in the west, suppressing rebellions, managing court politics. Parthia, far from the centre, could not be constantly defended. Local elites shifted allegiance. The Parthians did not destroy Seleucid cities immediately. They absorbed them. They adopted aspects of Hellenistic administration, coinage, and governance while asserting their own authority. Like the Seleucids before them, they ruled a mixed population through adaptation rather than replacement. Thus, separation became permanent. By the time the Seleucid kings attempted to reassert control, the East had changed. New dynasties had emerged, new loyalties had formed, the cost of reconquest was immense, and success uncertain. The East was no longer a province, it was a rival world. This loss transformed the Seleucid Empire fundamentally. With Bactria and Parthia gone, the empire's geographic balance shifted westward. Resources diminished, trade routes slipped from direct control. The empire became more Mediterranean focused, less Asian. Ironically, this made it more vulnerable. The eastern provinces had once served as buffers, absorbing pressure from nomadic movements and eastern powers. Without them, the Seleucid realm faced new threats closer to its core territories. The Parthians, in particular, would become one of the Seleucids' greatest long-term rivals. What is striking about this process is its lack of spectacle. There was no single fall of the East, no decisive battle that marked the end, no official acknowledgement of loss. The empire simply adjusted to absence. Seleucid kings continued to claim authority over lands they no longer ruled. Coins bore titles that reality contradicted. Maps lagged behind power. The idea of empire outlived its geography. This reveals a deeper truth about ancient rule. Empires did not always collapse under invasion. Sometimes they dissolved at the edges, where authority became optional. Distance eroded obedience. Local power replaced central command. The eastern frontier teaches us that control is not maintained by claims alone. It requires constant renewal. When renewal fails, separation follows. Yet the story does not end in decline alone. The breakaway kingdoms of the East were not failures of the Hellenistic project. They were its continuation in new forms. Greek culture persisted in Bactria for generations. Cities thrived, trade flourished, ideas moved eastward and westward alike. Even the Parthians, who replaced Seleucid authority, inherited much from what they displaced. Thus, the loss of the East was not an erasure, it was a transformation. The Seleucid Empire became smaller, more constrained, and more vulnerable, but the world it had shaped did not disappear. It adapted, fragmented, and reassembled under new rulers. The eastern frontier did not fall in flames, it faded beyond reach, and in that fading, the limits of empire were laid bare, not through defeat, but through distance. Ruling through culture, Hellenization and resistance. The Seleucid Empire did not rule Asia through force alone. Armies conquered territory, but culture was meant to hold it. Language, education, ritual, and identity became tools of governance just as important as garrisons and taxes. This strategy, often called Hellenization, was neither simple nor uniform. It was uneven, negotiated, and constantly resisted. Ruling through culture was an ambition, not a guarantee. From the perspective of the Seleucid kings, Greek culture represented order, rationality, and civilization itself. It was the culture of administration, law, and urban life. Greek language unified elites across vast distances. Greek institutions offered predictable governance. Greek education produced loyal officials. To spread Greek culture was to stabilize empire. But Asia was not empty ground waiting to be shaped. It was already dense with identities older than Greek memory. Babylonian, Persian, Anatolian, Syrian, Iranian, Central Asian. These cultures had their own languages, sacred traditions, social hierarchies, and historical pride. They had survived previous empires. They expected to survive this one too. Hellenization entered this world as an overlay. Greek language became the language of power. Royal decrees, coinage, city councils, and administration operated in Greek. To access imperial authority, one needed Greek literacy. This did not mean the population stopped speaking local languages. It meant that advancement flowed through a cultural gate. Language created hierarchy. Greek-speaking elites formed a thin but powerful layer above the majority. In cities, this distinction was visible everywhere, from inscriptions and public speeches to education and law courts. The gymnasium in particular became a symbol of elite identity. It was where young men learned Greek language, literature, athletics and civic values. Participation signalled belonging. For local elites, this presented a choice. Some embraced Greek education, adopting Greek names, customs and public roles. They became intermediaries between empire and population. Others resisted, retaining local identity while cooperating pragmatically. Both strategies existed side by side. Hellenization was never forced wholesale. The Seleucid kings lacked the capacity and often the desire to remake society entirely. Instead, they focused on cities where Greek culture could be concentrated and reproduced. Cities became cultural engines. Greek theatres, temples, councils, and schools anchored identity. Festivals celebrated Greek gods. Civic calendars followed Greek models. These spaces reinforced the idea that Greek culture was the norm of power. Outside cities, however, the picture changed. Rural populations continued local traditions largely untouched. Village life followed inherited rhythms. Temples maintained ancient rituals. Language remained regional. For most people, Hellenization was distant, visible, but not immersive. This divide limited cultural reach. Greek influence was strongest where Greek institutions were present. Where they were absent, culture remained local. The empire ruled unevenly because it was culturally uneven. Resistance emerged not always as rebellion, but as persistence. Local religions did not disappear. They adapted. Gods were renamed or paired with Greek counterparts, but worship retained familiar forms. Local law survived alongside Greek administration. Social structures endured beneath imperial oversight. This resilience frustrated imperial ambition. The Seleucid kings wanted loyalty, not conversion, but loyalty rooted in local identity could conflict with loyalty to empire. In times of stability, this tension remained manageable. In times of crisis, it became dangerous. Cultural difference became political fault lines. When authority weakened, resistance often emerged wrapped in tradition. Local leaders appealed to ancestral customs. Temples became rallying points. Greek elites were portrayed as outsiders. Cultural identity transformed into political resistance. The limits of Hellenization were exposed repeatedly. In eastern regions, where Greek settlement was thinner, local identity remained dominant. In Judea, religious tradition became a source of resistance. In parts of Anatolia and Mesopotamia, local elites leveraged cultural difference to negotiate autonomy. Hellenization did not erase identity. It reorganized power. Greek culture functioned as a ruling language, not a universal one. It unified elites across regions, but separated them from the majority. This created cohesion at the top and distance below. Over time, this imbalance shaped the empire's fate. Where Greek and local identities blended successfully, stability followed. Where separation hardened, fragmentation accelerated. Cultural policy could not compensate for distance, war, and weakened authority. Yet Hellenization was not a failure. Greek culture spread widely. Art, philosophy, science, architecture, and language moved across Asia. Hybrid forms emerged that enriched both traditions. The Seleucid world became a space of exchange rather than replacement. This hybridity mattered. It influenced later empires, including Rome and Parthia. It shaped regional identities that persisted long after Seleucid rule ended. Greek culture did not vanish with the empire. It remained embedded in cities, institutions, and intellectual life. The resistance too endured. Local identities proved adaptable and resilient. They absorbed influence without surrendering themselves. This resilience ensured that when imperial structures collapsed, cultures remained intact. Ruling through culture had limits because culture is not owned, it is lived. The Seleucid kings could promote Greek language, education, and ritual. They could reward participation and marginalize exclusion. But they could not force identity without destroying the very stability they sought. This tension defined their empire. Greek influence spread widely, but never completely. Resistance persisted, but rarely absolute. Between these forces, the Seleucid world existed in negotiation, an empire held together not by uniformity, but by compromise. Hellenization shaped the surface of rule, local identity shaped its depth, and when the Seleucid Empire finally declined, it was not because Greek culture failed, but because culture alone could not substitute for authority. What remained was a layered world, Greek above, local below, each shaping the other, each surviving the empire that tried to rule them both. That is the true legacy of ruling through culture. Influence without ownership, spread without control, and an empire defined as much by resistance as by power. Between Rome and the East, a shrinking empire. The Seleucid Empire did not collapse suddenly. It narrowed, pressed from the west by a rising Mediterranean power, and from the east by resilient Asian kingdoms. It slowly lost room to maneuver. What had once been an empire spanning continents became a state caught between worlds, forced to negotiate, concede, and survive in the shadow of stronger neighbours. This was the age of contraction. For generations after Alexander, the Seleucid kings had been among the great powers of the Hellenistic world. They commanded vast territories, founded cities, and claimed legitimacy as heirs to imperial Asia. But by the 2nd century BCE, the balance that had sustained them began to tilt. Rome, once a distant Western republic, entered the Eastern Mediterranean as a decisive force. At the same time, Eastern rivals consolidated power beyond Seleucid reach. The Seleucid Empire stood between Rome and the East, no longer dominant in either. Rome's arrival in the Eastern Mediterranean was gradual but relentless. Roman power did not advance first as empire, but as intervention. Alliances, arbitrations, and protections allowed Rome to involve itself in Greek affairs without formal annexation. Each intervention weakened existing powers. For the Seleucids, this was dangerous. They had long been one of several competing Hellenistic kingdoms. Now they faced a state whose resources, discipline, and political resilience exceeded those of any single rival. Rome did not fight endlessly among equals. It fought to win decisively. The turning point came with direct confrontation. Seleucid kings attempted to assert influence in Greece and Asia Minor, regions long contested among Hellenistic states. These moves brought them into conflict with Roman interests. What followed was not a long war of attrition, but a series of clashes that revealed the imbalance of power. The Battle of Magnesia marked a watershed. Seleucid forces were defeated decisively by Roman armies and their allies. The loss was not merely military, it was political. In its aftermath, the Seleucid state was forced to accept harsh terms, territorial losses, indemnities, and restrictions that crippled its ability to project power westward. Asia Minor slipped away. With that loss, the empire's western flank collapsed. Cities and regions once tied to Seleucid authority shifted allegiance to Rome or to Roman-backed states. Seleucid kings retained Syria and parts of Mesopotamia, but their reach no longer extended confidently beyond. Rome did not need to annex Seleucid lands directly. Influence was enough. Diplomacy became a form of domination. Seleucid rulers negotiated treaties from positions of weakness. Hostages were taken, borders were redrawn, each agreement reduced autonomy further. Meanwhile, the East remained unstable. The loss of Bactria and the rise of Parthia had already reshaped the empire's eastern frontier. What remained of Seleucid Asia was vulnerable. Eastern rivals were no longer distant threats. They were neighbours pressing against a shrinking core. This created a strategic trap. The Seleucid kings could not fully commit against Rome without exposing their eastern territories. They could not focus east without inviting Roman pressure in the west. Resources were finite. Armies could not be everywhere. Decline followed this logic. Internally, strain intensified. Reduced territory meant reduced revenue. War indemnities drained treasuries. To compensate, kings raised taxes, sold privileges, and relied increasingly on mercenaries. These measures provided short-term relief at the cost of long-term stability. Political legitimacy weakened. The Seleucid kings had once claimed authority through conquest, divine favour, and continuity with Alexander's empire. Now they ruled smaller lands under foreign pressure. Their titles sounded grand, but reality contradicted them. Court politics grew volatile. Succession disputes multiplied. Rival claimants appealed to Rome for recognition or support, further entangling Seleucid politics with Roman interests. Kingship became contested not only internally, but externally. Rome became the arbiter. In many cases, Roman recognition mattered more than local support. Seleucid rulers learned that survival often depended on accommodation rather than resistance. This shift eroded the ideological foundation of empire. The empire became reactive. Decisions were driven by crisis management rather than long-term strategy. Each loss forced adjustment. Each compromise set precedent. Over time, autonomy eroded not through defeat alone, but through necessity. Cities adapted faster than kings. Urban elites learned to navigate Roman diplomacy. They cultivated ties, shifted loyalties, and secured privileges. Cities that once depended on Seleucid authority now looked westward for protection and advantage. The empire hollowed from within. What remained was a core centred on Syria, still wealthy, still culturally vibrant, but no longer the heart of a great imperial system. Seleucid rule became local rather than universal. The irony was profound. The Seleucid Empire had been created to hold Alexander's Asian conquests together. Its rulers had mastered distance, diversity, and war. Yet in the end, it was undone not by a single invasion, but by the rise of a system more efficient than its own. Rome did not conquer the Seleucids immediately. It outlasted them. Between Rome and the East, the Seleucid state became a buffer rather than a power. Its choices narrowed, its ambitions shrank, its identity shifted from empire to survival. This transformation did not happen overnight. It unfolded over decades, through treaties signed under pressure, borders quietly abandoned, and authority slowly transferred from king to foreign power. Decline was not dramatic. It was administrative. By the time the Seleucid dynasty finally collapsed, much of its empire had already ceased to function as an independent power. The fall merely confirmed what reality had long established. The story of the shrinking empire reveals a central truth of ancient geopolitics. Empires do not always fall because they are conquered. Sometimes they fall because the world around them changes faster than they can adapt. Caught between Rome's expansion and the resilience of Eastern powers, the Seleucid Empire lost the space it needed to remain an empire at all. What remained was a kingdom in name, a memory in practice, and a lesson in the limits of power stretched too far for too long. Between Rome and the East, the Seleucid Empire faded, not with collapse, but with compression, and in that narrowing space history moved on without it. The final kings collapsed from within and without. The end of the Seleucid Empire did not arrive with a single invasion or a final catastrophic battle. It arrived through erosion, slow, grinding, and relentless. By the time the last Seleucid kings ruled, The empire they inherited was already hollow. Territory had shrunk, authority had weakened, and legitimacy was constantly questioned. What remained was not an empire struggling to survive, but a dynasty ruling over fragments while forces inside and outside pulled it apart. This was collapse from within and without. By the 2nd century BCE, the Seleucid state was no longer defined by expansion, but by survival. The loss of Asia Minor to Roman influence and the permanent separation of the eastern provinces had reduced the empire to its Syrian core and parts of Mesopotamia. Revenue declined, strategic depth vanished, every decision now carried existential weight, internal instability became constant, succession disputes plagued the dynasty. Seleucid kings rarely enjoyed uncontested rule. Brothers, sons, uncles, and distant relatives all claimed legitimacy. Court factions backed different claimants. Assassinations, coups, and rapid changes of ruler became common. Kingship lost its permanence. A ruler might reign for years, or for months. Authority depended less on lineage than on immediate control of the army and the capital. This instability undermined confidence among cities, elites, and soldiers alike. The army, once the backbone of Seleucid power, became a political actor. Mercenaries increasingly replaced citizen and settler troops. Loyalty shifted toward whoever could pay. Commanders gained leverage over kings. Military support could be bought, but it could also be withdrawn. The state became transactional. To fund armies and placate factions, kings raised taxes, sold offices, and granted privileges. These measures stabilized rule temporarily but weakened institutions. Corruption spread. Administration suffered. Long-term governance was sacrificed for immediate survival. Cities felt the strain. Urban elites, long accustomed to negotiating power, adapted quickly. Many cities sought autonomy, neutrality, or foreign protection. Rome, now the dominant power in the Mediterranean, offered arbitration and support. Cities learned that appealing to Rome could protect them from Seleucid instability. This undermined royal authority further. Externally, pressure intensified. To the east, the Parthian Empire expanded steadily. Unlike earlier rivals, the Parthians were not merely raiders or rebels. They were builders of empire, capable of absorbing Seleucid territories and administering them effectively. Mesopotamia became contested ground. Each eastern loss reduced the Seleucid ability to recover. In the west, Rome's involvement deepened. Roman generals intervened repeatedly in Seleucid succession disputes, often backing one claimant against another. These interventions were presented as diplomatic solutions. In reality, they transformed Seleucid kings into clients. Independence became conditional. Seleucid rulers increasingly depended on Roman approval to legitimize their reigns. Treaties limited military action. Hostages were taken. Decisions were influenced by foreign interests. The dynasty survived, but on borrowed authority. The final kings ruled a divided land. Civil war became frequent. Rival kings held different cities simultaneously. Antioch, once a symbol of imperial stability, changed hands repeatedly. Each transition weakened institutions and exhausted the population. Public confidence eroded. Subjects no longer saw the king as a guarantor of order. Loyalty became pragmatic. Cities aligned with whoever offered stability, whether Seleucid, Roman, or Parthian. At the same time, ideology collapsed. The Seleucid kings had once ruled as heirs to Alexander, champions of Greek culture and masters of Asia. By the final decades, these claims rang hollow. Titles remained grand, but reality contradicted them daily. The empire existed more in memory than in practice. Rome's final intervention was almost anticlimactic. In 64 BCE, Roman general Pompey reorganized Syria. He did not conquer a functioning empire. He formalized a situation that already existed. The Seleucid state, weakened beyond recovery, was dissolved and absorbed into the Roman sphere. There was little resistance. Cities accepted Roman rule as a guarantee of stability. Local elites adapted seamlessly. Administration continued under new authority. The transition was less a conquest than a transfer. The Seleucid dynasty ended quietly. No last stand. No final king remembered for heroism. No dramatic collapse. The empire that had once ruled from the Mediterranean to Central Asia disappeared through attrition, worn down by distance, war, internal division, and the rise of stronger, more coherent powers. Yet the end of the Seleucids was not an erasure. Greek cities endured. Hellenistic culture persisted. Institutions survived under new rulers. The Seleucid legacy lived on in the urban, cultural, and administrative fabric of the Near East. Rome inherited cities shaped by Seleucid planning. Parthia absorbed lands already accustomed to imperial rule. The world they governed continued without them. The final kings were not failures of character. They ruled an impossible inheritance, a shrinking state in a world that no longer supported it. Their reigns reveal a truth often overlooked in history. Collapse is rarely sudden, and responsibility is rarely singular. Empires do not always fall because of one enemy. Sometimes they fall because they have already been undone. The Seleucid Empire ended not with a single blow, but with exhaustion, its authority divided, its borders porous, its kings powerless to reverse the momentum of history. This was the end of Alexander's eastern heirs, not in fire, not in glory, but in silence, absorption, and survival beyond the empire itself. The empire that faded, Seleucid legacy and memory. Empires are often remembered for how they fall. The Seleucid Empire is remembered for how it faded. There was no single catastrophe that erased it from history, no final moment that announced its end to the world. Instead, Seleucid power dissolved gradually into the structures, cultures, and institutions of those who came after. Its political authority vanished, but its influence endured, quietly, persistently, and deeply embedded in the civilizations that replaced it. This was an empire that disappeared without disappearing. When the Seleucid dynasty ended in the 1st century BCE, much of the Near East barely paused. Cities continued to function. Markets remained open. Temples still stood. Administrators kept records. Armies changed banners, not routines. The Seleucid state had already ceased to feel like a living empire long before it was formally dissolved. What survived was not the dynasty, but the world it had shaped. The most visible legacy of the Seleucids lay in their cities. Across Syria, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and beyond, urban centres founded or expanded under Seleucid rule remained vital long after the kings were gone. Cities like Antioch continued as major political, economic, and cultural hubs under Roman authority. Their streets, institutions, and civic traditions were already aligned with the needs of imperial governance. Rome did not need to rebuild these cities, it inherited them. Roman administration in the eastern provinces relied heavily on the urban frameworks established by Hellenistic rulers. City councils, civic magistracies, taxation systems, and local elites functioned smoothly within Roman rule because they had already been operating under Seleucid governance. In many ways, Rome's Eastern Empire was built atop Seleucid foundations. This continuity shaped Roman power profoundly. Unlike the western provinces, where Rome imposed urban life more aggressively, the eastern Mediterranean already possessed a dense network of cities accustomed to imperial authority. Seleucid urbanization had prepared the region for Roman rule centuries in advance. Greek language and culture also endured. Long after the Seleucid kings vanished, Greek remained the language of administration, commerce, and intellectual life across much of the Near East. Roman officials governed Greek-speaking populations using Greek institutions. Law, philosophy, science, and literature continued in Hellenistic forms. The Seleucid Empire had not created Greek culture in the East, but it had normalized it. This linguistic legacy mattered enormously. It allowed ideas to move freely across regions. It connected Eastern provinces to the broader Mediterranean world. It shaped early Christian texts, philosophical schools, and scientific traditions. The Seleucids did not just rule territory, they shaped communication. Beyond Rome, Seleucid influence extended eastward into Persia and Central Asia. The Parthian Empire, which replaced Seleucid authority in much of the East, did not reject the Hellenistic world it inherited. Instead, it absorbed and adapted it. Parthian kings ruled through cities founded by Greek settlers. They minted coins with Greek inscriptions. They adopted administrative practices developed under Seleucid rule. Even as political power shifted, the Seleucid imprint remained visible. This blending created a hybrid world, neither fully Greek nor purely Iranian. It was a space of exchange where cultural boundaries softened rather than hardened. Art, religion, and governance reflected layered identities. Later Persian empires would inherit this hybridity. The Seleucid approach to ruling diversity, through accommodation rather than erasure, became a model. Local traditions were preserved, but framed within imperial structures. This strategy influenced how subsequent Near Eastern states governed multi-ethnic populations. The legacy of Seleucid kingship also lingered. Though the Seleucid rulers themselves were gone, their model of Hellenistic monarchy survived. Absolute kingship, ceremonial display, ruler cult, and dynastic legitimacy influenced Roman imperial ideology in the East. Emperors adopted titles, rituals, and imagery familiar to populations shaped by Seleucid rule. Power learned to speak a language people already understood. Memory of the Seleucids faded unevenly. In some regions, they were remembered as founders and benefactors. In others, as foreign rulers who came and went. Their dynasty did not inspire enduring loyalty, but their structures inspired continuity. This absence of myth is telling. The Seleucids were not remembered as tragic heroes or tyrants. They were remembered indirectly, through cities still standing, roads still used, and institutions still functioning. Their empire left few grand stories, but countless practical traces. This is the nature of quiet influence. The Hellenistic world itself outlived the Seleucid Empire. Even after Roman conquest and Parthian expansion, the cultural synthesis created during the Seleucid age persisted. Greek and Eastern traditions continued to interact, art styles blended, religious ideas travelled, knowledge moved along routes the Seleucids had helped stabilise. The empire faded, but the world it shaped did not. In historical memory, the Seleucids often stand in the shadow of Alexander, Rome, and later Persia. They are remembered as a transitional power, an in-between empire, yet this view underestimates their significance. Transitions shape history as much as climaxes. The Seleucid Empire served as a bridge between worlds, between Alexander's conquests and Roman order, between Greek culture and Eastern tradition, between conquest and administration. Without that bridge, much of what followed would have looked very different. They taught later empires how to rule Asia without destroying it. They demonstrated that culture could unify elites across distance, even if it could not erase identity. They showed that cities could sustain power longer than armies, and they revealed the limits of scale in an ancient world without modern communication. The Seleucids failed to remain an empire, but they succeeded in shaping empires. Their legacy is found not in monuments celebrating their kings, but in the durability of the systems they left behind. Roads, cities, languages, institutions, and habits of rule outlasted the dynasty that created them. This is why the Seleucid Empire did not truly fall. It thinned, blended, and passed on. By the time history moved fully beyond it, Seleucid influence had already become invisible, embedded so deeply in the fabric of the Near East that it no longer needed a name. The empire that faded did not vanish into nothing. It became part of everything that followed. And in that quiet persistence, the Seleucids achieved a legacy few empires ever do, not remembered for conquest, but for continuity. The Seleucids did not fall in a single moment. They thinned, adapted, and slowly passed their world on to those who came after. Their cities endured, their systems survived, and their influence lived on long after their kings were gone. History rarely ends with silence. Sometimes it ends by becoming part of something new. If you enjoyed this journey, like the video and subscribe for more in-depth history. And let us know in the comments which civilization or empire you'd like to explore next,